Welcome and thank you for joining Safran Software Solutions here on LinkedIn Live. I'm your host, Edmund Cartwright from the Safran marketing team here in London, and I am joined by Ian Nicholson of Emerald Associates in Calgary, Canada. He will be speaking to us on why Oracle Primavera risk analysis users should consider upgrading to Safran Risk. Welcome, Ian, and thank you for coming on today to share your perspectives regarding OPRA and Safran Risk with the project and risk management community.
Yeah, thanks, Edmund, and good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be in the world.
Great. I imagine that there will be questions that OPRA users are considering today, and that your expertise and insight can really help them towards answering some of the most significant questions that they have. So, presuming that there are key questions for OPRA users out there, I'd like us to just jump into it if possible. Is that all right with you? Shall we just go for it?
Yep, let's get started. So I'm just going to turn off my camera because I'm going to be displaying this on my small monitor, and people probably don't want to look at the side of my head for the next half hour. But if anyone has any questions or anything, there are questions that can be posted, and we'll cover them at the end. I'm going to talk about the questions that I hear most often when people are thinking about upgrading from Primavera Risk Analysis to Safran. Okay, so you can see my screen now, Edmund?
I can. Thank you very much.
Perfect. All right. So, as I mentioned before, we typically get the same questions every time when people want to move from Primavera Risk Analysis to Safran Risk. And we thought it would be a good idea to kind of try and address those questions up front so people can kind of get an idea of what they're looking at when they decide to upgrade. I'm Ian Nicholson. I'm an engineer with Emerald Associates. As Edmund said, I'm in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I've been an Oracle Primavera Risk Analysis trainer and consultant since 2001. I've been a Safran Risk trainer and consultant since 2017. I've conducted risk analyses in many different industries. I've worked as a risk director on some large public-private partnering projects. And my history with risk analysis actually goes back even further than my Primavera risk analysis days, because I actually started working with that risk in 1997, which hopefully doesn't give anyone an idea of just how old I actually am. So let's talk about, first of all, a little bit of an introduction, why we're having this discussion in the first place. Why do we want to upgrade? Well, when I started working with Primavera risk analysis, it was state-of-the-art software. Unfortunately, that was in 2002, so that was 20 years ago. The last major update of the software was in 2013, which is almost 10 years ago. And the last patch was in 2015, 7 years ago. Now, so what was state-of-the-art software in 2002 is pretty old and tired in 2022. I can't think of any other software that hasn't changed since 2002, except maybe Word. Things evolve, things change, and industry best practice also evolves. And in the last few years, people like PMI and AACE have come out with what they call best practices around risk analysis. And PRA was never built with those best practices in mind, whereas Safran was. So we now have the ability with this newer, more modern software to actually work in a much more effective way and come up with better results, particularly around things like integrated cost and schedule analysis. So what are the concerns that people have when they want to move to Safran Risk? Let's talk about the questions that we hear all the time. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just walk through each of them in the software. So the first question that we hear all the time is, does it work with P6? Then the next question is, can I import my existing Primavera risk analysis risk model into Safran? Can I import my risk register from PRA into Safran? Can I put uncertainty on tasks like I do in PRA? Can I perform duration QuickRisk and templated QuickRisks in Safran? Because that's a big part of what I do in Primavera risk analysis. Does Safran support probabilistic branching? And does Safran support existence risks? So we're going to talk about each of those today in turn. We will have time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions that you would like to post, please do so, and we'll cover them at the end. All right, so let's take a look. I'm just going to move to Safran.
I like the picture of the dog.
Yes. All right, so first of all, when you come into Safran Risk, how does it work with P6? So this is the welcome screen that you see in Safran Risk. You have the option in here to import an external file. Now, when you import that external file, it asks you where that file is, so we'll just choose one. It reads the file. Now, it will pull in Primavera files, P6 files, which are XER files. It will pull in Microsoft project files in an XML format. It will also pull in Safran files if you happen to be using Safran Project. Now, there's a very simple wizard that will then walk you through what's your planning unit. Do you have any uncertainties in that file? And also, how do you want to bring in your labor, non-labor, material resource assignments? So this is very much like what you would do in Primavera risk analysis. It asks you a few questions, and it's going to create the project for you. It really couldn't be easier. Now, when you want to send it back to Primavera, you can do the same thing. You can export from Safran as a XER file, which you can then read into your P6. It doesn't support P6 XML files at this time, but 90% of the users out there are using XER files, which it does support. Okay, next question. Can I import my entire Primavera risk analysis risk model? So the answer is yes, you can, but you do have to do it in a couple of steps. The first one is it won't read a .plan file, which is the native format that Primavera Risk Analysis uses, but it will read an XER. So anyone who works with Primavera Risk Analysis knows that you can always export everything that you want out of your model into an XER file. So we can read that XER file. Once you've done that, though, then you need to apply the risk model, because now at this point you've basically imported the schedule, at which point you can then import the various components of that model. So we can import our risk register, we can import our risk assignments, we can import all of those, but we need to do them sort of step by step. Now Safran makes that easy. I'm just going to open up a project real quick here. Safran makes that easy because in all of the modules, you have the ability to go in and import your project risks. So I can click on import and I can say from Excel. So when you're working with PRA, you can export to Excel. Then what you can do is you can import from Excel into Safran. So any of the risks, the risk register, any of those kind of things that you've got, you'll have to export them out and import them in. Now, do I recommend that you import your entire PRA risk model? Well, virtually everybody wants to do that to start with. Ideally, my recommendation would be to step back and look at Safran as a new tool that's doing things better, and follow the Safran process. And the Safran process is, we start off on the tab on the left, our home tab, we work our way across as we build our model. When I started working with Safran, I very much wanted to just do a straight import from Primavera Risk Analysis. And I found I could do it, but it didn't really take advantage of all the functionality that exists within Safran. So the next question is, okay, well, I want to bring in my risk register. So the risk register that we have in Safran is just like the one you would see in Primavera, with a few really nice enhancements. So we can list our risks. And again, we can export this out of PRA and we can import it into Safran. What's really nice about the way Safran does it is that I don't just have to put my risk events in here as I do with PRA. I can put my risk events and my uncertainties and my calendars, everything else, right into this module. So I basically have all of my risks in one place. Once I've done that, I can define pre and post mitigated positions, just like I would do in in Primavera risk analysis. So, and I can define the actions that will take me from my pre-mitigated positions to my post-mitigated positions. So all of those things are available within Safran Risk. The next question I get a lot is, can I put uncertainties on tasks like I would do in Primavera risk analysis? So this is something that's come up a lot, because when people work in Primavera risk analysis, what they're used to doing is looking at their critical and near critical activities, sitting down with the project team and saying, okay, what's the uncertainty on each of these activities in our schedule? So up to the last release of Safran, we would not have that capability. What we would do is we would actually put that in our project risks, and then when we move to our risk mappings, we would assign each of the uncertainties on a one-to-one basis between the project risks and the risk mapping. But in this latest release of Safran, they've now given you the capability to directly put uncertainties on activities. So this is a big step for people who want to do that or have made that part of their standard process. So how would I do that? Well, I go to the risk mapping tab. Now the risk mapping tab is where I take all the risks that I had in my project risks, and then what I can do is I can associate each of my risks with each of my activities. Now what Safran has enabled now is that I can actually choose any particular activity in my schedule, and I can define an uncertainty right on that individual activity. So I might say, okay, this particular design the camera lens has a triangular distribution, and here's what that distribution shape looks like. So again, I have that ability, if I want to, on my critical and near critical activities, to put uncertainties directly on them. Now, I also have the ability to assign any other risks that I want to as well to that particular activity. So this would be my base uncertainty, but that doesn't stop me from assigning any of the other risks or uncertainties that I have in my risk register. So in this case, this camera lens activity also has some communication concerns around it. And if I wanted to add a couple more, I could do that as well. Now, one of the really great things about Safran is it will also tell me what the impact is going to look like on that particular activity. So again, if I'm looking at this activity, let me scroll down a little bit. Okay, I have two uncertainties. I have my triangular uncertainty distribution that I manually entered. There it is, 24 to 38 days. Then I have my communication risk distribution. And what Safran will do is it will show me here's what the overall distribution shape is going to look like on this particular activity. So when I'm combining all of those together, when I put all my risks on, if I added another risk, for example, let's say I added a third risk like my merger or acquisition risk, the system immediately adds that and also shows me the impact here as well. So this is very useful because as I'm going through and putting my uncertainties on my tasks and I'm assigning risks, I can see the cumulative effect of all of that, which is something we always struggled with Primavera risk analysis. So the next question that we get a lot is, I use duration QuickRisk and templated QuickRisk quite a bit when I'm working with Primavera risk analysis. Now, how can I do that within Safran? Well, with Safran, if we go back to our project risks, we can define any number of different risk types within the tool. So the first kind of risk we have is a standard risk. Now, a standard risk will have a distribution shape. It will have a probability of occurrence, and that probability can be anywhere from 1 to 100%. So if I have an uncertainty that I want to put on an activity or a number of activities, what I can do is I can define a risk with, say, 100% probability of occurrence, and then I can define the impact. So in this case, let's take one of the ones that we have here. For example, we have our procurement process delayed. If we were to say that was 100% likely to occur, It has a distribution shape on it. So now it's going to happen on all of our activities that we associate this to. This is going to be just like we would do the duration quick risk in PRA. Now the difference is when I go to the risk mapping, instead of running a little utility that applies it to all of my activities, what I can do is I go to my risk mapping, and then what I can do is I can say, okay, I've got this risk that I've decided to use, um, which is my procurement delays. And then what I can do is I can assign it to individual activities that I want to assign it to, or I can assign it to, say, a whole WBS. So in this case, I want to assign it to all of the activities in this particular WBS. I click it on, and it's associated with all of them. Similarly, I can just take it off by clicking it off all of them. Okay, so this gives me a lot of flexibility. In Primavera risk analysis, I could use the templated QuickRisk function to create filters and that sort of thing. But here I've got a lot more flexibility because I can see exactly where this is going to be assigned, and I see it as a separate entry. So when I use the duration quick risk in Primavera risk analysis, I had to be very careful not to override those manual entries that I put into the system around my my base uncertainty. But here it's going to be an additional uncertainty, which means that I don't have to worry about accidentally overriding all the work that I already did. So I can get the same functionality, but I have a lot more confidence that it's going to be applied properly and it's not going to mess up something else. Next question that we get a lot is, what about probabilistic branching? Well, again, in the past, Safran supported probabilistic branching through the scripting module. Now, the scripting module allows you to put in your own Java code into your model, which is like the old VB code capability that was taken out of OPRA in 2013. But that was kind of beyond the capability of most users. Now, there's some users of the system who love to get in there and write code, but I got to admit, I'm not one of them. I did use the scripting function and I found it not that bad, but I'm not a programmer, so I would much rather have it built into the tool. So what Safran has done is they've given us the ability in the tool to actually do probabilistic branching with this latest release. So in this case, I've got an activity here, which is test my GPS system. Now, when I run my test on my GPS, I've got three different things that could potentially happen. Okay, the first one was I passed the test and all I have to do is do some documentation. So that's my first possible outcome. And I've got that here as this activity here, document GPS. The second possibility is that I will have to do some tweaking of the software and then I can document it. In other words, I've got some minor deficiencies that'll have to be corrected, but I don't have to retest. So in that case, that would take a little bit longer to happen. That would take 15 days instead of the 5 days of just doing the documentation. The third possibility is I've got to do some major rework of my GPS system, and then I've got to do my documentation, in which case I'm going to spend 25 days. So I've got all of these linked to my activity as successors, but really what I want to do is I only want the system to go through one of them at a time. So I can define what percentage of the time I go through the first option, which is just document, or the second option, which is do minor tweaks and document, or the third option, which is do major rework and then do my documentation. So the way that I do that in Safran is when I go to the risk mapping tab, I can go down to my my activity here, which is test the GPS system. And now I have a tab here that says probabilistic branch. Now what I can do is I can go to that tab and I can tell the system I want this to be a probabilistic branch by clicking the icon, and then I can define the probability of the logic going through each of those branches. So in this case, there's a 50% chance that I'm going to just have to do my documentation. There's a 30% chance I'm going to have to do minor tweaks and then do the documentation. And there's a 20% chance I'm going to have to do major rework and before I can do my documentation. Okay, so the system allows us to do that just like we would do in Primavera risk analysis. So again, this is a very powerful tool, because the reality is, in the real world, we often come up on decision points in the schedule, and we need to be able to model that. Okay, the last question that we're going to cover today is, do we support existence risk? Now, again, this is something that could be covered in the previous releases of Safran by doing some scripting, but as I said before, it's not something that the average user wants to do. So in the latest release of Safran, they've now given us the ability to map existence right in our risk register. So if I go back to my Project Risks tab, and what I can do is I've got a risk here, which is called a non-existence risk. Now, this is where it's a little different from Primavera risk analysis. In Primavera risk analysis, you would define the probability that it does exist. Here, I'm going to define the probability that it does not exist. So in this case, we're going to say that for testing the guidance system, there's a 10% chance that I'm not going to need to do that activity at all. Now, if I don't need to do that activity, then it's basically going to disappear from my schedule. Now, when it disappears from my schedule, I can also tell the system, do I want to keep the links or do I want to remove the links around that particular activity? So keeping the links would be equivalent to dissolving the activity in P6. Removing the links would be equivalent to deleting the activity in P6. And this is consistent with the way that Primavera risk analysis handles this as well. You have to tell it which way you want it to handle those links. Now, again, what I can do is I can map that to my activities in the risk mapping. So if I go down and look for my test guidance, which is here, I can then go in and say that there is this probability that we will not need to do this work. So what I can do is I've got this testing existence risk here, and then what I can do is I can just turn it on. So basically, 10% of the time, this particular activity will disappear from my model. The remaining 90% of the time, it will be in the model. Now, I can also apply this, by the way, my non-existence can also be applied to my cost model. So if there are cost items that may not be required, I can also map that risk to my cost model. Now, one of the things that Safran is much better at than Primavera risk analysis is the tight integration of cost and schedule modeling. So in Primavera risk analysis, the only way that we could do a combined cost and schedule analysis was to resource load our schedule. And anyone who's ever done that knows that that's a lot of work, and it's a pretty tedious process, and it's very difficult to keep it up to date as the project progresses. So Safran allows us to have a separate cost module where we can build our costing right into the tool, and then we can decide which of our cost line items are associated with our schedule. And the idea here is that some of our cost items, for example, this one for testing resources, is only related 50% to a schedule item. The remaining 50% is not. So in the case where I've got material and I've got labor on one cost line item, the material is probably going to be unaffected by the duration of the activity, but the labor will definitely be impacted. So what I can do is I can say only a portion of the cost is associated with the activity and another portion is not. So the ability to link those together gives me a lot of flexibility in terms of how I model cost and schedule together, as opposed to having to build this very convoluted, very difficult model just to try and build costing into my schedule risk analysis. Okay, so Edmund, let's open it up now for questions.
Okay. That's really quite comprehensive, Ian, and I can just imagine that some of the folks out there who've been using OPRA for some time, maybe many years. OPRA has become a bit of an industry standard. There might be still a little bit of hesitancy and a bit of anxiety about making the migration from that platform to Safran Risk. Is there anything that maybe you would like to kind of impart to anybody who's feeling anxious?
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. And I actually have clients with projects where they've written Primavera risk analysis as a requirement into the spec, for example.
Right.
Um, and um, at some point, people need to make a change. So I have a client right now on a very large project, and I've been working with them with their Primavera risk analysis. Again, the same kind of thing that they made a decision when the project started 4 or 5 years ago that that's the tool they were going to use. And it's kind of funny because I constantly get complaints from them about, oh, it's too slow, it's not handling my large model very well, this, that, and the other thing. And I keep saying, well, guys, at some point we got to make the decision to upgrade, right? Like it Safran's made it as easy as they can to move, but there's still going to be some work required to do that. But you're going to get all these benefits, right? You're going to get a much faster system. You're going to get a more modern interface. You're going to have that whole workflow that works better. You're going to be able to build your integrated cost and schedule models. At some point, it just makes sense to move. And I think a lot of clients are at that point, particularly because we're starting to see, being that it's been 7 years since the last even patch of PRA, that people are starting to struggle. It's not running very well on some of the new systems. Things like Surface Pros, it doesn't seem to run very well on. So again, it's never easy to make that kind of change, but
Right.
sometimes it's the right decision for the project.
I mean, they would probably also be interested in understanding maybe the magnitude of the change in terms of is it days or is it weeks? It probably depends on the size of the organization, how many projects are being currently held, what the size of their database, etc. Is there any kind of steer you can give them on their thinking there in terms of magnitude, order of magnitude of the migration, or is that a bit too difficult to just kind of pull out of the air?
It's actually not that difficult to make the move. The big question is, are you going to do, a cutover and work in the new system going forward, or do you really want to take all those old models and bring them forward? Because bringing those old models forward can be a fair bit of work. If you're just going to say, okay, we're going to get some training, we're going to, have some discussions about what we do and how that fits in the new software, and we're going to use that going forward, that's easier, because one of the things you got to remember too is that the same team who originally developed PertMaster, which became Primavera Risk Analysis, that same team was heavily involved in the development of Safran Risk. So there is some continuity there.
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of see the same processes. It's kind of like if they'd sat down. In fact, I think they actually told me they sat down and said, okay, if we were doing this again, knowing what we know today, what would we have done differently? And
Right.
that's been a big part of it. And so, there's very much that. Um, the continuity in terms of vision is still there, but the process is different. So,
Okay.
you know,
Okay. There's a question from the floor here. I don't know if you can, in the upper right hand of your screen there,
yeah, I can see them.
you can see that they've got, do you prefer to import your original XER or summary XER of big schedules?
Hmm. I did a whole talk about this at a risk conference a while ago. That's probably the most divisive question in the whole industry. Do I build a schedule specifically for risk analysis, or do I take the source schedule? Um, and if I'd say that the industry is fairly split on that. My personal preference is to use the source schedule, and the reason my preference is for that is I don't want the scheduling team to have to be able to say that's your schedule, that's not my schedule.
Right.
And I've run across that quite a bit. Whereas if you are working with their schedule, that's not an objection that they can make. Um, However, that does mean that you're dealing with much larger schedules, which means you need a faster scheduling engine, which Safran has. and you need to be able to deal with things um, like correlation, which Safran also does very well. So there are tools in Safran to make that easier, but that's a decision the project team has to make. I know some companies have processes that say we're going to develop a no more than 400 activity schedule for risk analysis. So if that's what you're working with, that's what you're working with. But my preference is to use the live schedule.
Right, right. I don't know about the next question, whether or not you want to tackle that about can you run any code using scripts to show its functionality?
So that's a little beyond the scope of
Yeah.
this session, but absolutely, you can. The scripting is very powerful. You just have to write the JavaScript in there.
Mm.
There are examples actually. If you go to the manual that comes with Safran, they have a whole chapter on how the scripting works, and there are samples in there. Um, and they're very helpful to kind of walk you through it. The first couple times I did it, I struggled a little bit, and then I found it actually got easier when I started, building upon um, my knowledge. And maybe we'll do a separate LinkedIn thing where we can run a few examples and show
Yeah,
people how that works.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Uh,
We do intend to run more LinkedIn Live events in order to enable people in their journey with this. I guess the other one is it seems that we've got for lump sum projects, do you prefer to create cost items as per contract pricing or contractor cost estimates after removing any contingency?
um, so that's a good question. So absolutely, you want to remove the contingency so you're not double dipping. And I've got a bunch of stories about when people haven't done that. But to the question there is, okay, do we create the cost items per the contract pricing or per the contractor cost estimate? Again, that kind of depends. If you're dealing with lump sum contracts, you may have limited information about what the contractor's breakdown is. They may have given you a single line item and you don't really know what that breakdown looks like, in which case it makes it much more difficult when you're trying to build that cost model to actually um, be able to break it down into the items. If you're dealing with self-performed work or time and materials work, you will have a lot more detail about what that looks like. And if that's the case, then again, I would prefer to have more detail, because remember, when you take your risks from the risk register from the project risks module, and you're going to assign those to your cost items, having that extra granularity makes it quite a bit easier to do that. So again, if you have too little detail, you end up putting a lot of risks on one line item, whereas if you've got more detail in the cost breakdown, it allows you to work with more granularity in terms of how you assign the risks. And that's also useful when you're linking it to the schedule as well, because more granularity gives you a better integrated cost and schedule result. And if you're doing things like probabilistic cash flows, you want that granularity between your costs and your schedule.
Mhm. I have one more question to ask because we're just coming about to the end of our session here, which it's been a really good session. It's always nice to keep things really crisp and at pace. But the question is, I believe you've probably answered it to some degree. I mean, does Safran bring new functionality to quantitative risk analysis? You talk about OPRA versus Safran, and talking to the OPRA users, potentially upgrading or they should upgrade. Would you say that Safran's bringing some new functionality to this quantitative risk analysis?
So the first one that I talked about is the ability to do integrated cost and schedule. That's huge, and that has been identified by AACE and PMI as an industry best practice. You could do it in PRA, but it was hard work. You had to build a resource-loaded schedule, which meant you had to create a number of activities in your schedule simply to hold costs,
Right.
which is not a great thing to have to do. As I mentioned, it's a lot of work. And then each time you have an update, you've got to rebuild it basically from scratch because some costs have been spent. It's just very difficult. So that's the first one. The other thing that I find very powerful in Safran, and you could do it in PRA, but again, it was a lot of work, was I can do a lot of what if analysis where I can
Mm.
say, okay, what if I'm running these 5 risks in their pre-mitigated position and these other 5 risks in a post-mitigated position, so the project team can understand how effective the mitigation strategies are going to be. In PRA, you could do it, but you basically had to, it was designed to run all pre-mitigated or all post-mitigated. So to mix and match, you had to build a new model and rebuild everything for each of those scenarios. Whereas with Safran, there's a bunch of radio buttons to say, run this risk in a pre-mitigated position, run this one in a post-mitigated position, and exclude this other one. So for what-if analysis, it's very powerful. And that's a big part of understanding what your mitigation strategies are going to look like. So, it just gives you a lot more flexibility. The other one that I find very useful is what we call analysis by exclusion. So in Primavera risk analysis, if we wanted to understand the impact of a risk, and I'm talking on the schedule side, but it works on the cost side as well. If I want to understand the impact of a risk in days, I can look at my tornado chart in PRA, but it gives me a correlation between the duration of a risk and the duration of the overall project. But if I want to tell the project team how many days that risk is going to impact them, what I need to do is turn the risk on, run the model, turn the risk off, run the model again, and then compare the durations. But Safran does that automatically. So it will take your top X number of risks and turn them off one after the other automatically and tell you at a P70 confidence level, here's exactly how many days each of those risks are impacting us. And that's a big deal because people would do it manually in PRA and they get good results, but it was a lot of work. You'd have to, it would literally take days to go through and turn off each one, run the model, turn it back on, turn off the next one, run the model. And people aren't good at that. Chances are you're going to make a mistake and leave 2 of them off, or you're going to forget to turn one off, whereas computers are very good at that. So it just made total sense to have the computer do that process. But in PRA, we had to do it manually. And again, that comes down to, what people want to do has matured in building risk models, and Safran is more aligned with current best practices.
Yeah. Well, I think that gives our viewers a lot of food to think about, so some points to really chew on. Hopefully, it also gave them some direction about some of the things that they're considering, some of the issues that they're facing, and maybe the differences between working in OPRA versus Safran Risk, and that there are some significant benefits to making a switch, and as you called it before, upgrading from OPRA to Safran Risks. So I think we've done a good job today, and we will do another LinkedIn Live event. Remember, to our audience, that's P.Eng Nicholson, can be his contact details there at the bottom of the screen. He also has a website, which is now appearing at the bottom of the screen. This just remains now for me to say, Ian, I want to thank you for your time and your expertise today. And from Safran Software Solutions and Emerald Associates, thank you guys out there for joining. We hope to see you again on the next LinkedIn Live event. We'll see you later. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Cheers.